Alright, this is part 3 of our French firearms videos, and this one covers French military service handguns. And to kick things off, we're starting with the MLE, or MAB 1892 Ordnance revolver. This was the first smokeless powder handgun that France officially used. Actually, initially it was adopted for an 8mm black powder cartridge, but the action was strong enough that they were able to switch over to loading it with smokeless powder without any kind of ill effects. It had a really strong frame. That said, it wasn't a heavy powerhouse cartridge. I mean, it was, a step up from 380, and that was about it. But it was kind of the times. It actually worked really well in the trenches of World War I, but we'll get to that in a minute. This revolver is often erroneously called a Lebel revolver. Colonel Lebel had nothing to do with its manufacture, adoption, or anything design. It is a simple revolver, just swing out. Now it does swing to the right for horse-mounted soldiers to use. It looks like a loading gate here, but it's not. It's actually just what keeps the cylinder on. Traditional double action, single action, firing pin there. Has a hexagonal shaped barrel, which is quite nice. Has wooden checkered grips with a lanyard ring at the base. Again, very, very common. It has, a bit in common with the old Swiss 1882 Schmidt revolver. There's also a little bit of Rasgasser in it, it seems like. But very, very common revolver. These went into production in 1893 and were in main production until 1924, and French arsenals were refurbishing old World War I guns up through about 1930. It wasn't officially retired until 1945, the end of World War II. This was the standard issue service gun of France during World War I. Although they used other guns, this was the standard one. And again, it was still in limited use during World War II. Very basic, robust revolver, very reliable. It's easy to clean. There's one screw here you take down to take off the side plate, and it comes apart very easily. And these are mostly made by MAS, and refurbished in parts from other arsenals. But this is the first French smokeless powder revolver, and it's basically a scaled down version of the MAB 1873. Which fired an 11mm cartridge. Alrighty. Next up, get over here. We have a French military contract, Savage Model 1907, and this variation with the lanyard loop military style was called the 1907/1913 modification number 3. By Savage. The French just either called it the Savage pistol, or they would call it the MLE 1914, but most often just the Savage pistol. This is a cool little gun. It fires 7.65 .32 auto. Savage manufactured these well before World War I and up through World War I and a little bit afterwards. When World War I began, France discovered it just did not have enough firearms, so they contracted with several people, including Savage, and this is one of them. The first 3,000 Savages shipped over were just standard 1907 pistols, but then when they were able to catch up, those are just what Savage had on hand. They shipped about 20,000 more military models to France between 1915 and 1917. The military model has a few changes. It has a loaded chamber indicator. It has a fixed rear sight. It has a smaller cocking strike. It's actually a striker, but we'll get to that in a second. It looks like a hammer. This was smaller. And of course it has the lanyard ring, which is kind of neat, nice and big, but it also folds up to fit on next to the grip there, so it actually can be put out of the way. Now the Savage is a really neat gun. Of course it's a blowback, it's not a blowback. Because it is, even though it's 32, it uses a rotating barrel. And it's striker fired. That looks like a hammer. It's not. It's a striker. It's actually very stiff to cock, but you can. I think they put it on there so you could have a second strike if the first one fails. It is quite small. The grip is actually still quite slim. Now the mag catch is in the front, unlike a lot of guns. and it holds 10 rounds in a double stack magazine. It's one of the earliest double stack guns ever made. So quite a large capacity for the day and also for its size. And very reliable, shoots really well. Portugal also purchased about 1,100 of these during World War I. Well, these stayed in France until after the war, and some of them were surplused out in the 50s by, I think, Firearms. But yeah, a lot of these were used by France to supplement the 1892. So you'll see a lot of the French military Savage revolvers. Move on. Next up, we have, found it over here if I can, here we go, a very famous French gun. This is a Ruby. This is a French military Ruby. I've seen it referred to either just as the Roubaix or the Spanish gun, also the MLE 1915. Like the Savage, it's in 32. It's a much more simplified gun. It's based on the Browning 1910 and 1900, but very simplified. These are produced in Spain by many people. There's a lot out there on the Ruby, several great websites. So check those out. Well, and it's clear that companies like Savage couldn't sell France enough handguns, and companies like MAS couldn't produce enough. France started turning over to Spain and other allies, and originally they signed a contract in May of 1915 for the company that would eventually become Llama to produce 10,000 of these pistols a month. But by August they already upped the order to 30,000, which was just too many for one company. So that company subcontracted to 4 other companies to produce. And then France kept upping the number, 50,000 a month and so on and so forth. Eventually it went out of control. There were 40 to 45 different companies, some of them with just a couple of employees and a donkey producing these. So variations, there are tons of them. There are just all kinds of wild variations in these pistols. But generally speaking, most of them have this length of barrel. They have a full-size grip that holds 9 cartridges in the magazine, heel-mounted mag release. Obviously, it's not drop-free or anything close to it. They have a lanyard bar or loop on the grip. They usually have checkered wooden grips. Simple blowback gun. No rotating barrel like on the Savage. The safety's here. Flip it up. It also can double as a slide holdback if you need to. It is hammer fired, but it has a concealed hammer, so there's no really way to decock it, just pull the trigger. This is the military model, so it has a rivet here added. What that was for was to protect the safety in a holster, so it wouldn't accidentally get knocked off. These were proofed. They have a couple of stars on them to show. They also were given a 2-digit manufacturer's code on the frame. But yeah, very simple 32. Big and blocky. The reason they did that is they were making them out of relatively low-grade steel, so they just beefed everything up. No grip safety. That was one of the simplifications that they did to make manufacturing faster and cheaper. The magazine is serial to the gun. But yeah, just a very robust little gun. It did really well in the trenches of World War I because it's just not real susceptible to mud and dirt because it's just a simple little blowback. So it's not a whole lot to go wrong. Yeah, this is a French military Roubaix, and these stayed in France definitely through they were officially surplused in the 20s, but a lot of them stayed around with police and private purchase as well through World War II. In total, France purchased between 900,000 and 950,000 of these. A lot of them were lost to attrition, but they bought a lot of them. So kind of a neat little gun, and these are a great collector's piece for people liking World War I history because they still don't bring much money at all. So it's a great way to get into a gun in a still shootable caliber you can find from that era. Now, since we had that out, we're going to move to the post-war era, or the inter-war era. This is a French MAB Model D pistol. And this is actually based on either the Browning or the Ruby, if you like. Again, it's a blowback 32. Has the same style safety here. It locks the slide when it's on. Also the trigger, I'll show you. Now this one does have a grip safety, which is kind of nice, I suppose. It's pretty out of the way as far as grip safeties go. It's very unobtrusive. A small little lanyard loop at the base of the grip. Its magazine also holds 9 cartridges. Again, a simple little gun. These first started to appear in 1933 by MAB. The Model C was primarily intended for civilian concealed carry and police. At that time, France allowed handgun ownership for civilians. The Model D here was produced primarily for military and police use. And the French military did purchase, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it was around 50,000 before World War II, and then several more after World War II. This one is a post-war model. But yeah, they produced, I don't think anyone knows an exact number, but quite a few. I think I've seen them up to 300,000 serials and probably even beyond. But quite a few of these were made. Manufacturing didn't end until at least the 60s. And again, they were used by a lot of police agencies, and they were most officially, prominently known by the Bank of France. They actually adopted the Model D. So you can see some that have a BF prefix. But a good, simple little gun. The ergonomics are quite nice. The trigger isn't bad at all. It points very naturally, quite lightweight. So definitely a neat little gun. These were also produced under Nazi occupation in France during the war. So you'll see some that have Waffenamt markings on them. So that's also kind of neat. But again, just a simple little service sidearm that supplemented the main ones. Well, we'll move on to some main ones now. Put this back here. Now, the 1892 was the official French service sidearm handgun up until the 1930s, but by the 30s even they recognized, even with their limited budget of that era, that they really needed to adopt an automatic. What they ended up adopting is this right here. This is the 1935A, made by SACM, SACM. It is a pretty basic design, single action only. It is a locked breech, very 1911 style, except it uses 2 cam pins instead of 1. Single action, as I said. That's kind of an interesting safety. You flip it up and it's actually a firing pin block. You can still pull the trigger, but it blocks it from going all the way and hitting the firing pin. That was actually one of the requirements. There's a long development and trials history that dates back on these to the early 1920s, but there were trials in 1932 and then 1935, and this became the winner. Interestingly, the FN High Power was originally made for the French trials. That's actually why I ended up with a magazine disconnect safety, because that was one of the French requirements. This one also has it. But yeah, these went into service in 1935, and SACM was a relatively small company, so they couldn't produce a whole lot. They delivered a few thousand to France before the Nazis invaded and ran the country over, and then the Nazis kept these in production. But they were in production during World War II and then also after. They continued well on through the 1940s, and I think they discontinued around 1949, 1951, somewhere in there. But this was the official standard issue handgun of France, the first automatic, and it balances really well. Now, one interesting fact is the designer of these, Charles Petter, actually went on to work in Switzerland and helped develop the P-210, which is quite famously known. And then from that, the 210 miniguns are developed, such as the CZ75. So in a way, this is kind of a grandfather to that gun and the Jericho and all of that. Yeah, this fired a unique cartridge as well, 7.65 long, which was basically a derivative of the old .30 caliber Pedersen cartridge. and only France used it. It's a neat little cartridge, but it's essentially just a little bit of a souped up 32. So it wasn't, again, like with the 1892, it wasn't a high power cartridge. We actually have some over there. I should have pulled one out to show you. But it's an interesting little round. Fun to shoot, quite accurate, but doesn't have a lot of power behind it. So France had these in service before World War II, through the war, and then a little bit after the war as well. They were replaced in 1950 officially, and then it took them about 10 years to actually go out of service. But yeah, this is the 35A. However, the story gets a little more interesting because there's also the 1935S. Now the 35S was also in the 1935 trials, and it did very well, but it was beat out by the 35A. However, when it was clear that SACM could not produce enough pistols, the French government turned to MAS to ask about getting some 35Ss to help supplement. So this is a very similar gun to the 35A as far as features. It has the same safety style that blocks the hammer, because they went through the same trials. Of course, the cosmetics are a little bit different. The barrel sticks out, the grip angle's a little bit different. Same type of tilting bolt system. Still shoots 7.65 long. Still has an 8-round magazine. Lanyard ring at the base of the grip. But yeah, they MAS was able to ship under 2,000 to the French military in 1939 before the Germans came over. And during the war, these were not in production. They either hid the tooling, hid the blueprints, or the Germans weren't interested in them, but they weren't in production in World War II. However, as soon as France was liberated in 1944, they put them back into production, and this is one such gun. It has a G prefix serial, and it was produced in, late 44, sometime in 1945, so it's a very late war gun. These had a Parkerized finish. Some of the later ones had a blued finish made. They kept these in production until around 1951 or 52, until they were replaced by the 1950, which you'll see in just a minute. But yeah, it's again it's kind of interesting that they adopted two 1935s. This one was never officially the service sidearm. However, they actually probably had more of these in service than they did the 35A. So, kind of interesting. I guess you'd call it a substitute standard. Yeah, thought we'd show this. These guns feel very nice if you haven't shot one. Alrighty, so the next handgun that was adopted in France is, actually this was made in France, but it's not a French gun. This is a P-38, often called a Grey Ghost. World War II, the Germans overran the Mauser Obendorf factory and captured it and kept guns in production. They produced guns at Obendorf starting in May of 1945 until 1946 when the Soviets protested and they stopped. They were building using mostly leftover German parts, and they made some parts themselves, such as these steel grips. Some of the early production German/French P-38s were using the late style Mauser plastic grips, and then later when they ran out of grips they started making these pressed steels. This was called the MAB 1945, and a lot of them were built. I think around 50,000. A lot of them were given to the Foreign Legion because there were a lot of Germans in there and they were familiar with it. These saw service in Eastern Asia quite a bit, over in Vietnam and other places, also down in Africa. As you can tell, it has a Parkerized finish, hence the name Grey Ghost. But yeah, this is basically a French produced P-38. Has all the same features of a P-38 you'd be used to. And they kept these in production until 46. They also produced another little run of 500 using leftover parts in Paris, I think around 1950, 1952. But those were blued and they were for the French police. But this is kind of interim solution for the 35A and S because of the weaker cartridge. This fires the standard 9mm Luger, so it's a little more powerful. And quite frankly, it was cheap. At that time, France didn't have a lot of money. The parts, the factory was free. The parts were mostly there. Aside from paying the workers, the guns they could produce at a very low price. So they did until they ran out of parts and until the Soviets complained. But yeah, if you see some of these. By the way, the code on this is SVW45. There's also some SVW46s, and it'll have a star on it to show French acceptance. Yeah, I thought we'd just show. Not strictly a French gun, but definitely was in French service. Like I said, quite a few thousand of them. Well, they had those, and they had the 1950. So, by the late 40s, they knew they needed a new standard issue sidearm, and they wanted to go with the standard 9mm to, be like a lot of their allies, and also they saw the power actually mattered to them versus the 30 caliber long, the 7.65 long. This is a MAC or MAC Model 1950, adopted in 1950. It is essentially a scaled up version of the 1935S, and that's because after World War II, MAS was manufacturing the 1935S, and then they ceased in '46, and the MAC began manufacturing them for them, and then built them until the early 50s. So they already had the tooling and the know-how to build the guns, so it was easy to scale it up to fire 9mm, and that's basically what the 1950 is. It has the same style safety that blocks the hammer. Still single action only gun. Parkerized finish. Bakelite ribbed grips. 8 round. Let me check that. Magazine. Very, very basic gun. This one's pretty heavy. It's a very solid steel. Very robust gun, and that seems to be how France likes their handguns. So robust and reliable. These did quite well over in East Asia. In fact, these are still officially in service today in the French military, so they've had a long service life. They went into production in 1951, and they continued through the 1960s. And yeah, saw a lot of service. There's not very many in the USA. Back in the late 50s or early 60s, Interarms imported 200 of them from a country, I can't remember which one, but it wasn't France. And then there's some that American soldiers brought back from Vietnam, but that's about it. They haven't been officially surplused yet. So the 1950s, while they don't bring just a ton of money, are very hard to find. But a fun gun, quite a comfortable gun, and one I'm very happy to have. Has a little lanyard bar in the back here. They kind of went away from the ring and got to less obtrusive. Yeah, standard French service handgun for, well, over 50, 60 years now. The production was delayed a little bit until 1956, until they went into full-scale production. They were produced by MAC originally, and then by MAS through the 1960s. And actually, production didn't end officially until 1978, at which point over 340,000 had been produced. Yeah, the 1950s is a very solid, good filling gun. That's probably why it's still in some limited service today. And for our final gun, this is not officially French military, but it's so very French. This is the P-15. This was made by MAB, the same folks who made the Model D. This is a 9mm. It holds 15 cartridges in a double stack magazine. These mags are pretty awesome because it's actually a milled follower and milled floor plate. This whole gun is basically machined. There's I think only 3 stamp parts in the whole thing. Now this is a blowback gun. It doesn't use a tilting barrel. It's still single action. When you pull it back, the barrel rotates. Since it is 9mm, it's pretty stiff, but I think they took the rotating barrel from the Savage, which you saw a few minutes back. Shoots 9mm. These were developed in the 60s and first came out in 1966. Again, they were never officially adopted by the French military, even though they tried. They went into some trials. And the French did purchase a few for special forces and whatnot, more commercial pickups. French police also used them, and the Finnish border guard. So they were used, but in relatively small numbers by quite a few people. Over 100,000 were produced from the 60s through 1982 to 1985, when production ended. It's a little hard to pin down, but through the 80s, let's say. very well built. A lot of these were imported into the USA. This one here was brought over by Halco around 1980. Has a parkerized finish, which some of them were parked, some were blued. But this was really one of the last French designed and French manufactured handguns. After this, they went to the Beretta 92G, and also they use some Glocks today. But yeah, this is the P-15. The earlier ones were sometimes marked PA-15. The name's a little bit transitory. It just stands for Pistol Automatique. So yeah, but made by MAB, and technically a commercial gun, but they saw a lot of limited military use. Very nice trigger, and since it is French, they have a magazine disconnect safety, because that's just one of those things that France really enjoys. But yeah, this was part 3 of our French handgun video, and will conclude the series on French firearms. But yeah, for more information, please check out our blog article. A lot of details and numbers in there. I've always really enjoyed French guns, and they're very, very interesting. Well, as always, this is Misha, and please feel free to comment, and any suggestions, please let me know, and I'll be happy to address them. And thanks for tuning in.